the shot. Like, how did you stay so cool after such a big play?
Oh, like, because when I shot, I expected to make it. So, like, I don't shoot trying to miss.
Welcome to Pensari Basketball. My name is Robert, and today we are talking about OG Anunoby. Now, let's be honest, Raptor fans, if this is 3 years ago, we're having a pretty different discussion about OG Anunoby. We're talking about him potentially as the next Kawhi Leonard, and granted, those conversations were premature even when they were happening. There was at least some statistical basis for having those discussions when we had them. But now, 3 years removed from those discussions, we're having a very different type of discussion about OG Anunoby. And, granted, he has spent the entire offseason dominating the headlines in trade rumors and rumors about him being dissatisfied with his role. So let's talk about it. Does he deserve a bigger role? Is there still some untapped potential? Are we still talking about potential all-star? If you're new around here, my name is Robert. This is Pensari Basketball. If you haven't hit subscribe, hit notifications, and grab your coffee, grab your water, and let's get to it. Now look, I'm not going to argue that OG Anunoby had a brilliant year last year. There's some sort of understated genius in between his analytics. His numbers weren't great last year, and that's pretty much consistent across the board, that the trend line is not going up for OG Anunoby over the last couple of years. However, there are some interesting parts of his statistical profile that are worth pointing out. For instance, his defense has remained incredible. He is one of the best isolation defenders in the NBA. His distance traveled on defense, the role that he plays, the players that he's matched up on against night to night, it's just the stop-go of coming in out of injuries, back and forth, and just, I think that sometimes the stats can be a little bit misleading, right? I mean, if anything, you can look at last year as a continuation of a downward trend, or you can look at it as a complete fluke, right? There was almost a 5% drop in true shooting percentage. His three-point shooting percentages were down. We know that he's a better three-point shooter than that. He's shown it. Starting out the season, it looked good. Like, everything looked really good for OG for the first 4 or 5 games, and suddenly it just tailed off and he couldn't buy a basket. And suddenly the moves looked awkward and he was kind of rolling into these weird shots, and he became probably one of the worst isolation scorers in the NBA, right? And then it's an injury, and then it's another setback, and suddenly Scottie Barnes is emerging, and Pascal Siakam is emerging, and Fred VanVleet's an all-star, and suddenly OG's not being talked about as much, and it's out of sight, out of mind, and now it's really difficult to talk about OG as being anything other than the 4th most important player on this team. And how important can a player be if they're just the 4th most important player that you're talking about? Because, he's not more important than Scottie Barnes. I mean, fresh new toy, right? And rookie of the year, and he's definitely not more important than Pascal Siakam, who is 2-time All-NBA, right? And he had that dominant finals run, and there's all that history, and he was a big part of the championship run, and OG Anunoby, of course, missed the championship run, and he's not more important than Fred VanVleet, right? Because Fred VanVleet's an all-star, and we got Freddie all-star, and that whole thing. And, when I did my player rankings of the Raptors, I had OG 3rd. I had a Fred VanVleet, and some people thought that was a little bit strange and peculiar, and I would argue that I am doubling down on that. I really do think he is the 2nd or 3rd most important player for this team going forward. One thing that I will say about OG Anunoby is that we have seen the usage tick up for OG. We have seen Nick Nurse give him a more and more expanded role on offense, and more shots for OG are coming off of self-created opportunities. And I think that sometimes this position of putting players in uncomfortable positions, like we saw it with Precious Achiuwa last year, right? Now with Precious Achiuwa, we saw the returns right away. We saw this with Pascal Siakam, right? In the bubble, in Tampa, we saw Pascal Siakam go through some serious growing pains, and now we see the other side of it. And of course, now we're talking with the benefit of hindsight, because we know that the end result of Pascal Siakam getting all those reps, trying to be a point guard, this gigantic point guard in Tampa, and how ugly some of those possessions looked, and how much the Raptors lost giving Siakam those opportunities. Now we see that it has culminated in him becoming an All-NBA performer and having this great year last year. And so now we're evaluating it with the benefit of hindsight and saying, well, see, Siakam's great. But what if OG Anunoby's progression from standstill three-point shooter who really can't dribble the ball, can't really pass and create for others. What if that progression is just taking a little bit longer than we would like, but that eventually he will get there? Because that's what I'm arguing right now. I actually do believe that while it's not always pretty and sometimes he trips on his own feet, that I do believe that in the end, what we'll have with OG Anunoby is a top 35, top 40 player. I think he could even ascend to a top 25 player. I really do think that his upside and Siakam's upside are actually quite similar. I just think that by the eye test, it seems like one of these players is way more naturally gifted at basketball, and the other one seems to be more of like a football player masquerading as a basketball player on the basketball court. If you're going to look at OG Anunoby from the worst parts of his statistical profile, you're going to come to the conclusion that this guy probably shouldn't be given more of an opportunity in the Raptors offense. If you're only looking at isolation scoring, it was pretty much pathetic last year. He was probably the worst isolation scorer. He and Fred were really terrible out of isos for the Raptors last year. And I just think that with OG Anunoby, sometimes it's just a matter of overthinking, because at the end of the day, what I initially saw in him and what I found to be most appealing about him as a prospect was his ability to generate space. Now, granted, it was just a preseason game, but we saw it against the Boston Celtics, that how physically dominant he can be in the post if he can just curb some of those balance issues. Because, when he really wants to, there aren't a lot of players who can keep him off the block. And, he has the length and the shooting touch and certain mechanics and just enough ball skills to keep guys honest. And so a lot of the ways that Pascal Siakam kind of scores around players because he's quicker, faster, OG just sort of powers through. There's more of a power game, and I think that he could become a really dominant 3-level scorer for the Raptors if he can just curb some of those issues. Because I do think that, when it comes to seeing the game, I think that he does see it. I mean, it's not always pretty, and some of those passes look a little bit funny and weird, and it's not very smooth. But man, he really does see the passes. He has the right mindset for the game. So I think that, quite frankly, Raptor fans would be wise to remember that we've learned this lesson with other players before. We've learned it with Kyle Lowry, DeMar DeRozan. There have been players who've gone through lulls or growing pains with the Raptors, but I think that a little bit of patience is going to pay off with OG Anunoby, and I really do believe that as he's 25 years old and just now entering his prime, I do believe that some of these on-ball creation opportunities that haven't resulted in the most efficient possessions over the last couple of years, and we've seen flashes of three-point shooting percentages that are close to 40%. We've obviously seen the defense. We've seen bits and pieces of OG Anunoby's game each year, and I think that he is just 1 year away, or maybe this is the year, of just putting it all together in a cohesive, healthy, hopefully healthy package. And I think that when we see that package come together, sure, we might not be talking about Kawhi Leonard. We might not be talking about a 2-time finals MVP. We may never talk about OG Anunoby in such bullish terms again, but I do believe that we will be talking about him as a potential all-star and a guy who the Raptors really want to think about as a core 2-3 players. If there's a core of 2 or 3 players for the Raptors, I think OG Anunoby should be included in that group of players, and I'm really looking forward to this season and hoping that he proves me right. So this has been my rant on OG Anunoby. I am obviously a lot higher on him than most analysts are. I think a lot of people have just sort of seen the development curve fall off, and they've said, hey, this guy's pretty much been the same player for 3 years. But I think if you look into how he's scoring, even though the percentages are down, it just feels like this is a guy who's trying to evolve from one type of player to another. And as we've seen with Kawhi, as we've seen with Pascal Siakam, as we've seen with a lot of players in the past, that transition does not always yield immediate results. So I think that OG Anunoby still has a ton of potential left. I hope that he'll be healthy. I hope that some of those balance issues are going to be curbed this year, and I really do hope that he gets the bigger role that he's been after, because I, frankly, I'm probably in the minority, but I think he deserves it. Let me know in the comments below. Are you high on OG Anunoby? What do you think he's going to average this year? Always a fun discussion. And if you're new around here, my name is Robert. This has been Sorry Basketball. Hit the subscribe button. We are so close to 3,000 subscribers. Let me know in the comments below what you'd like to see next from me, and what are you looking forward to most for opening night, because that's 2 days away now.